If everyone's sitting comfortably, good morning, welcome. I'm Sarah Gilmore. I'm Professor of Organisation Studies here at Cardiff University Business School. And this morning, our business breakfast is going to focus on and introduce you to a fantastic book that's just been released, which deals with one of the most pressing issues in HR. And they're going to make the case, this lovely team here are going to make the case as to why it is. And it concerns how we carry out disciplinary and grievance issues in our organisations. The book, sadly, isn't available for sale here, but we're going to provide you with a link. I just wanted to start with that because I think it's one of the most important things I want to cover today and to introduce the breakfast. So this is me. I should also say that I come to this as a head of one of the sections at Cardiff Business School. You probably know that we're a very large entity. There's 5 sections, divisions, departments, whatever you want to call them. And I head up the management, employment and organisations section. Before we get into it, I just wanted to outline some coming events in 2026 so that you have them in your diaries. Here we go. I'm sure you've probably all got them penciled in, but in case you haven't, here you go. Also, if you are interested in our Help to Grow programme, Danielle James is here. And if you want to get in touch with her at the end of the session, I'm sure she will be very happy to have a chat. Again, if you've got any ideas or suggestions around what we could focus on in the Business Breakfast programme series, do let Linda know. You can email her, but she's also at the back here. So do get in touch. We're always open for great ideas. Again, if you want to join our community and get all the sort of up-to-date information about what we do, then please scan and sign up. For people who are devotees of the Business Breakfast, you know that we will be recording and taking photographs during the session. If you want to ask any questions, and we will be leaving plenty of time for questions, then we'll have them at the end. For people online, if you can do this via the chat, and for people in the room, the usual routine applies. Just put your hand up, and we'll get you a mic. So that's it from me, and I'm now going to hand over to Andrew, who is going to lead the rest of the session. Take us through what we're going to do, and I will come back and convene the Q&A. So, Andrew, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. And just a really big welcome to this. So as Sarah said, we've just had this book published within the. I'm really keen. So this is a slide that you may see popping up, and actually buy a copy on. So if you go onto the website and and enter B13, they will radically drop the price. So and give a bit of, but actually we really want to take you on a journey that we've been. That's why it's great to have my colleague. But actually, I just wanted to start in terms of we know actually. How do we know that? Hughes over the last couple of years. Last month or two, Channel 4 put a programme out and a bit closer to home, we work. I guess we start perhaps from Is that better? Good. So we start from a position of actually recognising the harm. So my name is Andrew Cooper, work for Nyman Bevan University Health Board within NHS Wales, and this is a journey that we started probably 4 or 5 years ago, when we recognised that we were overusing our disciplinary policy and process, that actually we were putting far too many people through it, where we could have addressed workplace issues in a different way. So that's where it started. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. So we've got Dr. Adrian Neal, who's Head of Employee Wellbeing at Nyman Bevan. We've got Liz Rogers, who's Deputy Director of People at the Welsh Ambulance Service. Rhiannon Windsor, Deputy Director of People and OD, NHS Wales Performance and Improvements. She wins the title for the longest title. And then we've got Deb, who is from Rhondda Cynon Taff. We've been working with Deb outside the NHS in terms of applying some of these lessons, and Deb's going to talk in a moment. But I am going to ask each of them to talk about what brought them on this journey. So, Rhi, can I start with you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks everybody. Nice to see you all today. So I've worked in the NHS for just over 20 years now, mainly started in operational HR. Met Andrew about 3 years ago when he came and spoke to a peer group of deputy directors about this work. And I really thought about all the opportunities that we've probably missed over the course of my profession to take a step back and think about what's going on in a situation. Found ourselves often diverting straight into formal processes. So absolutely recognised the opportunity to think a little bit differently about how we apply our processes and the impacts they have on individuals. And within the health service specifically, you know, they're high risk environments. Our staff are responsible for patient care. So really see the tension between doing the right thing for our patients, but actually also doing the right thing for our people.
Morning, everybody. Good morning. So I'm a clinical psychologist with a business psychology background, a slightly strange animal. And I've been interested in, I guess, 2 factors that led us to this place. One was just a general interest in, or not so much an interest, but a concern with factors that are classed as secondary stressors in occupational settings that inhibit people's ability to perform. So not necessarily their direct exposure to the work, the technical dimensions of the work, but often the cultural or the process-based factors that get in the way, and we all know what those are like. And I was particularly interested in organisational change going back 10 odd years, and how when that's done badly, which is often the case, it creates havoc and there's waste. Fast forward, working within an NHS, an integrated wellbeing system or service for NHS staff and Nyman Bevan, I also then became exposed to the direct consequences of poorly carried out processes in the form of people self-referring to the service seeking help. And as a clinician, it's actually really difficult to work with people caught up in these processes because they don't stop. You know, short of them developing some very aberrant coping kind of strategies around stoicism, which generally don't work, these things just create fear and anxiety and shame. So you cannot really take the edges off that. So these processes are going for ages. We know within an Nyman Bevan, our average length of investigation was 9 months. So we were working as a service, trying to help staff that were caught up in these processes. And for the clinicians, including myself in the service, that was very difficult to do. But we were also witnessing direct exposure to these processes that I knew were partly unnecessary or certainly could be mitigated in other ways. So there was a very real need, I felt, to do something constructive about that process or those sets of processes, because they were just creating havoc and the impact is significant. And we'll talk a little bit later on the impact. So for me, 2 drivers for getting me into this space to think about how to do things differently.
Morning all, lovely to see everybody. So I've worked in HR for 30 plus years now in lots of different sectors, including manufacturing, banking, digital technology, local government, and into the NHS more recently. And within that period of time, I'm working within the sector and this sector and in other sectors. I go back to why I wanted a career in HR, and it wasn't to cause people harm. That was not why I intended to join HR. It was about giving people the opportunity to be the best they could be, to fulfill their potential, and to enjoy coming to work every day. And you don't get that through causing people harm in the workplace. So from a values and kind of perspective, this work really resonates with me. I think also the longer I spend within the kind of work of HR, that the more I see actually what is it about the process that you want in terms of an outcome. So why do we do processes like this? What's the point of them? And for me, it's about people learning. And so a sanction is not always the way that people are going to learn through a process. So that's very much another driver. And we see the cost and the impact on the individual. We see the cost and the impact on teams, our teams, my HR team, for example. We see the cost and the impact on the organisation when people are not in work. So there are a whole range of organisational drivers in order to do this the right way. So I think that's probably, for me, why I've got involved with the work.
Thank you, Liz. Burdar, everyone. So I'm Deb Hughes. I work in Rhondda Cynon Taf Council. Values. Yeah, we're cutting in and out on these, aren't we? Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, my colleagues have already spoken really clearly about the ethics and values, and that's really what's driven me in relation to this work. I think some of those unintended consequences of HR processes I've seen really clearly while working with people through the occupational health setting, working with them. I'm a counsellor as well, so I've seen some people who've had some really just awful experiences. And Liz talked about the impact on the individuals and the organisations and the wider teams as people go through these processes. And for us within the values, a lot of people's families work within the organisation, and it's also the impact on our communities. So thinking about doing things a different way was really, really important for us. But I think at the heart of it, it was thinking about how we look after people.
It's a game year in terms of pass the mic, isn't it? So really great to have those summaries from colleagues here today. For us, we always say in a presentation like this is not about removing the disciplinary policy from an organisation. It clearly has a key place within the organisation for addressing workplace issues. I guess the sense of, and certainly what you've heard from colleagues this morning, do we always use it appropriately? Do we always use it well? Do we always question whether it's the best approach to take? And I guess that's where this work started for us, was a lot of questions around, can we deliver disciplinary policies more compassionately? Can we actually deliver them in terms of meeting the obligations from a legal perspective, but also looking after people better through it? And can we have a better understanding of what the cost is when we run these processes, and equally when we make the wrong decision to take somebody through this process? So I'm going to ask Adrian to talk to this next slide, which really talks about our growing understanding of the level of harm and impact from these processes.
Andrew. So when we started in parallel to our kind of practical application, working with colleagues from HR within Aaron Bevan, we also started a program of research, and very quickly realised there's not a lot out there, which speaks volumes. Which is surprising, actually, for something which is such a commonplace process. So I think at least 2 years ago, we were looking at understanding the scope of investigations, and just in NHS England alone, there was 16,000 in a year. So it just gives you a sense of, okay, this is just one part of the public sector. What about the whole workplace? And we know the work from ACAS is looking at the impact of conflict in the workplace, and it's huge, the cost. So we thought, actually, this is really unknown. So toe in the water, we started looking at impact, probably because we work within an employee wellbeing service with an individual in mind, trying to understand the let's just call it the biopsychosocial, but I could also frame in economic and cultural impact of a process. So our first piece of research was a case study, which we got a whole range of professionals to evaluate. The case study was a real case study. And it kind of generated a whole range of really interesting responses that indicated that the harms or the impact is a little bit like dropping a pebble in a pond. It doesn't just go one direction. It doesn't just go towards the individual who is in the crosshairs of the investigation. It's a bit dramatic, but you know what I mean. Actually, it has a cascading effect across multiple systems in multiple directions. So we very soon realized actually there is a direct implication for the individual in terms of their own general well-being. It depends how you define well-being, but certainly their quality of life, their enjoyment of their work, but also on their health. We realized there was an impact on their system and their families. Debra was saying, if you were working within a system and your colleagues are often your family members, word travels fast. It gets into those other systems. So there's a wider systemic impact on colleagues vicariously, either through witnessing or through people's relationships. There's an impact on HR colleagues and managers who are caught up in these processes. And as we started to dig and kind of try to get some quality evidence around what these impacts were, we just felt this stuff was going wider and wider. And one of the book chapters talks about a case study where a senior HR colleague was starting to do some more fundamental digging, looking at a team issue, and pulling the string. That whole process where the team was essentially split started off 6 or 7 years ago with a failed or very badly managed disciplinary process. So we know these things have legacy. We know people have memories. We know people don't forget. So our systems are slightly more organic and they just ripple out. So it's kind of cascading. And actually, we know that if it affects the people doing the work, it'll affect the work and the quality of the work. It'll affect how people view the organization. So actually, the stuff just keeps going. Whereas when you start to have a look at impact to begin with, the initial point, and actually the points we made earlier in the introduction, was these incredibly sad cases where people take their own lives. Yes, there is that dimension to it, but that is just one part. Incredibly sad, incredibly shocking, but it's far more diffuse, the impact. So that slide is just a really useful way of giving you a sense of the breadth and depth and range of impact that we're starting to look at. And once you see that, you're thinking, crikey, we really do have to look at these things because they are not cost neutral. They are hazardous to everybody involved, and they also have an organizational impact, which will end up with a bottom line impact. So for us, it's about, there's a moral driver, but there's also a really important driver on what is good business and minimizing waste.
That's great, thank you. So we started, certainly being within the NHS, looking at what does the new language needs to look like and sound like to engage colleagues around this. So we looked to the patient safety movement. Now, the patient safety movement is about 40 to 50 years old, and it started when healthcare professionals actually recognised that they were actually causing harm to patients, sometimes leading to death, certainly not intentional or maliciously, but a recognition that they worked in complex systems, and often in those complex systems, harm happens. And for the healthcare movement, their acknowledgements that they were causing harm because of that system led to a massive change in terms of how healthcare is delivered today. And something came out of that called avoidable patient harm. 3 key words that said, what's the harm that we are doing to our patients that can be avoidable? And you'll see on that slide that comes from the World Health Organization, healthcare professionals identified key areas in terms of healthcare delivery that they could actually build interventions to make those areas a lot safer. So working within the NHS, that was a concept that was known, but we actually then took it into what does this look like from a HR perspective? So we introduced the concept of avoidable employee harm. What are the things that we do in our organisations, the way that we run our processes, that actually has the potential to harm our staff, and that's avoidable? And that's what we used to bring in the work on employee investigations. So again, it wasn't about finger pointing or apportioning blame or saying to HR colleagues or managers, you're harming people. It was much more about even running a policy and a process is complex. There's multiple stakeholders. There's complexity in terms of the issues that are being addressed through it. How do we take lessons and learning from the patient safety movement and apply them? So I'm going to go to Liz first and kind of say, Liz, how did that land with colleagues within the Welsh Ambulance Service?
Generally, when we first kind of took this concept into the organisation, there was a lot of buy-in, so senior management buy-in, which was really important to us organisationally because we need to lead from the front. There were colleagues in the room who absolutely got it. Lots of trade union support. We worked very closely with our trade unions, and social partnerships important to us as an organisation. So our trade union reps obviously supporting their members through processes. We're very aware of this and we've been having conversations, etc. about it. Overall, my people services team generally on board, but that's not to say that everybody was in the same place on it. And there were resistance from some parts of the organisation, I think more around the not knowing about what it meant. So, you know, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to people in my team who I have an issue with, who have done something that we don't want them to do, where a patient has come to harm, to use that as an example, you know, where people haven't followed process, etc., that they should have. So, you know, what is it that I can be using instead of this process? What do I swap out? So we did need to overcome some of that kind of resistance and some of those concerns, and especially, you know, a number of colleagues in my people services team who had fundamentally followed the process. Because this is what we do, rather than making it kind of person-centric. So it's very much about trying to shift that across from a policy-led a kind of approach to a person-led approach. So yeah, mixed bag from us, but it was some really interesting conversations as a result of it.
So Rhys, similarly, I know you had conversations kind of broadly. How did avoidable employee harm land at the beginning?
I think similarly to Liz in terms of mixed, I think the phrase itself is quite challenging. It's quite, you know, you stand back from it a little bit and go, oh, going back to your point about joining the profession, person-centered, you know, this is about improving lives for working people. That's what our profession's about. This is quite a harsh, I think, phrase. And I think in all honesty, I think when we started talking about the concept itself and what we mean by that, I think there was a lot more buy-in. But I think the truth of it is the actual phraseology itself, I think, you know, it's quite difficult to get your head around, because I don't think anybody ever intends to set out on these processes to cause any harm. So I think we have had to work across in the system just to really get that deeper understanding about what we mean. And I think when we started to talk about impacts on the HR profession, on managers, on investigating office, on trade union, all those individuals who work around those processes, when we all step back from it, I think we recognise the harm that is caused to us as well. So I think it's really started to embed now. But I think at the very beginning, I think it's fair to say it's a bit Marmite as a phrase itself.
Great. Going to come to Deb, because actually we developed this within the NHS with Hours Common, and we've been working over the last year or two to think, can this be applied beyond healthcare? And I guess for a local authority, that was our next step. Deb, how did it kind of land with colleagues, with you?
Yeah, I guess a very similar picture, to be honest with you. I think when you first understand the concept, it's an absolute no-brainer. You know, it's so important to think about how our processes impact. But thinking about how we could actually adopt it, how we could work with that, how we needed to kind of think about the further education, particularly within HR, was challenging. And I think one of the big things that really landed for me when Adrian showed that graph, exactly how many people are impacted by it. You know, we talk about the individual, and certainly through occupational health, we'd noticed there was a huge amount of sickness absences related in relation to disciplinaries. But also the impact on HR colleagues. You know, some HR colleagues were profoundly affected by some of the issues and some of the individuals that they were dealing with. But it was definitely a culture change. It was definitely a new way of thinking about things because, as you said, nobody sets out to cause harm, but it's the byproduct, the unexpected consequences that really hit hard. So for us, again, it was challenging. We had some people who absolutely adopted it and got it straight away. Excuse me. Others who thought, but what about the policy? Does it mean we're not going to take people through disciplinary? What if this happens? So there was a lot of kind of hand-holding, continues to be a lot of hand-holding around it in terms of taking it on a case by case, but really reinforcing that it's not about not taking people through disciplinary. It's about making that the last resort.
Brilliant, thank you. So for us, in terms of introducing a new concept, we actually wanted to ground it in terms of what does impact look like. So within our health board, we ran a 13-month intervention that looked to bring in perhaps new approaches to running the policy. There was 2 or 3 things that we did. We got executive sign up to say we will take a last resort approach. So again, not saying we're going to remove the policy, but we're going to work with managers to help them think about what are the alternatives that they could do before they embark on a formal process. We developed an initial assessment that helps managers collect far much more information in order to help them to make the decision as to whether they were going to proceed with a formal process or not. And we were able to kind of bring these figures together at the end of a 13-month period. You know, really shocking, I guess, in terms of these numbers, 70% reduction. So that meant, you know, they were numbers we were putting through a process that we really shouldn't have been. But what does that look like in terms of sickness days? You know, over 3,000. And when we kind of added it up from the financial perspective, we'd worked out that the average cost of an investigation every time we pressed the formal button was £20,000. So you can see that ramp up and we quickly get up to kind of over 700,000. So for us, this was an intervention that kind of said, we can do things differently. It is possible to do things differently. It built the moral case in terms of we can't keep doing this to our people, but it also built the financial case as well. So that's the journey that we've been on. We've called it an improvement journey. But I want to go really back to Adrian and Liz to kind of say, in a sense, this sounds really successful, you know, great numbers, but actually it hasn't always been straightforward, and it probably continues not to be straightforward because this is a challenging area. Adrian, kind of lessons from our journey.
A couple of guest take home is it's never over in terms of improvement and change. You get a kind of Hawthorne effect, don't you, when you put a lot of spotlight on something and but if anything changes. For me, that was that kind of 12, 13 month pilot. I think the hard work is afterwards, is keeping people's eye on a shared goal, is being clear about what you're doing and why, because, you know, in busy kind of complex organizations, there's always more work and there's always more demands. So I think just keeping your eye on that kind of North Star, helping the team adapt and learn. And then maybe that's the key is how do you create conditions that are genuinely environments where people learn and develop. And I think that's something that I think any organization should aspire to, because that makes them better and more efficient and more productive, no matter what your business is. But I think there is something very important about how we establish cultures that allow people to learn, which includes saying, oops, we've ballsed up, or we've dropped the ball, or we don't know what we're doing, even though we think we've got it right for a period of time. So I think there's constant energy and resources needing to put into these programs, which nobody talks about.
Agreed. It's like spinning plates. You have to keep going back and back and back. So this is a culture change piece of work. You're never going to change a culture in 12 months' time. This fitted in really well with other pieces of work that we were doing in our organisation around culture change. However, there was also a conflicting piece of work because we've also done a lot of work in the space of sexual safety. So some of my colleagues across the organisation were really struggling with this kind of cognitive dissonance, my favourite psychology phrase, balancing avoidable harm against cases around sexual safety. So that was a real challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge in the organisation, I'm sure. you absolutely have to keep spinning the plate on it and talking about it. We badge this initially as compassionate practices in our organisation. And another piece of work I think we need to do going forward is to help colleagues, especially our managers, not think about it one-dimensionally around avoidable harm is just about disciplinary investigation processes. It's not. There are so many other areas and avenues in which you should be using this as a way forward. So again, I can see lots of work around there. It also really helps with our psychological safety in the organisation. I think some of the things hopefully have come through this morning has been around, the impact in terms of cost, the impact in terms of morale, the impact in terms of the ripple effect for all those other individuals involved in processes. Whilst they might not be the person at the centre of the investigation, they're playing critical roles in that, and that impact is significant across those teams. So all those things just put you organisationally in a far better place than where we were when we started this a couple of years ago.
Brilliant, really helpful. Somebody said this week, I think on a call that we're doing, that improvement isn't a straight line. You take 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And I think we've been increasingly, as we've worked with organisations, you can have the quick wins, but actually keeping your people on board with it is that challenge in terms of changing staff, but also changing priorities. How do you keep this as a focus? Oh, look, there's the slide. There's a book out on this. But I just wanted to say, in terms of that slide that Adrian spoke to, in terms of the circles, there's 4 chapters in the book that kind of unpacks those levels of harm and impact. So it really goes into the detail. And one of the reasons we focused on that was, what does a business case for an organisation look like? So actually, I don't think there has been a business case. It's certainly recently that you could actually use to say, we have to change because this impacts our people, it impacts our culture, it impacts our finances, and it also impacts potentially our service delivery. And then also, just to kind of, Adrian, Liz talked about the intervention programme. So there's a chapter in the book on that kind of explains what was done, what the work looked like, what the positives were, and what some of the challenges were too. So hope that's helpful. Just one other thing on the book. We've done 3 sections within it. So the first section was counting the costs, which we've kind of unpacked there for you. The second was making the change, and what changes do we need to make to be more compassionate about our processes. And that's not about losing procedural compliance or legal requirements to meet, but actually, how do we make that change? And I'm going to turn to Rhi now, Rhi's written a chapter in the book around what does a compassionate investigation look like? What does a compassionate culture look like?
Thanks. So, yeah, we talk a little bit about the work of Professor Michael West, who talks about compassionate leadership through the lens of 4 compassionate behaviours. And we take a case study, an actual case study through that lens around where are those opportunities to apply those leadership behaviours through our decision-making processes as we find ourselves challenged with a specific issue. So it talks a little bit around understanding. So really taking time to listen and learn and understand what's going on. So when an incident happens, really getting underneath, taking some time to understand, and then through dialogue. So talk about attending, making sure that you're spending time to really get underneath what's gone on, going out, having back and forth conversations around what happened, really getting underneath it. And then he talks a little bit around empathizing. And I think that's the bit for us that we talk about, really putting ourselves in other people's shoes, what's going on for the individual, what's going on in the wider context that's actually taken us to that point of what's happened. And then we talk a little bit about helping through the lens of leadership, taking some really thought steps forward. And does that mean instigating a process, or does it actually mean taking a slightly different route? So we talk about Michael's work through those 4 leadership behaviours, and actually it's grounded, that compassionate leadership work in Wales that we talk about an awful lot in a really practical grounded sense. So the chapter explores an opportunity in a case study where maybe we hadn't taken time to really deeply understand and attend at the very beginning. And we find ourselves often doing that at the end of a very difficult, drawn-out process. I've often sat historically in hearings and thought to myself, wow, if we'd actually taken time to listen at the very beginning and look at those organisational contexts that's driven these incidents, probably could have avoided this actual position even happening in the first place, or we could have taken a slightly different route, which would have potentially put us through a process, but at a much more lower level in terms of approach. So yeah, a real opportunity to step back and think a little bit more.
So often when we talk about compassionate investigation, somebody turns around and says, does that mean we're going to go soft on somebody? What would be your response to that?
No, absolutely not. And I think the challenge that we've had when we're taking this work forward through various organisations is this is really complex and this is really difficult. And for managers, this is a really, really hard position to find themselves in. And doing that due diligence really, really early on actually means you do the right thing. I think it's not at all taking a soft approach. And I absolutely share the views that Liz says around the tensions, around there are times when we do need to take formal routes. You know, they are a part of organisational life and they should be used to address really poor levels of conduct. But actually, this is not about taking compassion. It's not about being kind and avoiding. Actually, it's much, much harder than that. It's actually probably one of the hardest elements of management is really going into those difficult spaces and thinking, I've got to make a really difficult decision here. And I'm doing that with far more information, which is actually a really, really difficult place for our managers to find themselves in. Which is why when we're talking about this work is around making sure that we're doing it in a much more collaborative approach, that these decisions that we're taking are not in isolation, that we work with colleagues to get onto the right course of action, but it is far from the easy route or the kind route necessarily, as you say.
Okay, thank you. So I want to put this slide up so you might recognise one of our panel members on there, but Liz and the team at the Welsh Ambulance Service won the first Avoidable Employee Harm Award, and I wanted to talk to you a little about the awards. So the HPMA is the Health Care People Management Association. That's the body that represents HR professionals working in the NHS across the 4 nations, and they launched the Avoidable Employee Harm category back in the year. Now, for me, this says 2 things: that the professional body is acknowledging that it does harm. That is really powerful, that actually we can't start solving a problem until we've acknowledged that there's harm there. But also what this award does also shows that we're looking at creating new ways of working and new ways of operating. So I just want to say massive congratulations to Liz and the team, but it's more about how we take that work forwards and actually think, what are the other ways that we can be reducing harm to our employees? Oh, look, there's a slide. I'm not going to say too much. So we've worked with professional bodies. We've worked with the CIPD. The CIPD are increasingly interested in getting involved with this work. But I guess one of the things that we looked at is actually compassionate leadership, building intervention programs within organisations. But really the heart of change is often the policy and the process that's used to drive that forward. So I'm going to land on you again a bit, just to kind of tell colleagues where we've been on in that journey in NHS Wales, and just say NHS Wales employs around 70,000 people, and this is the policy that would cover all those people if a disciplinary route needed to be taken.
Yeah, so our workforce policies in NHS Wales, like Andrew said, apply to all bodies in NHS Wales. So there's about 70 to 80,000 staff that we've just taken a review of the All Wales Disciplinary Policy and Procedure, and really pleased to say that it actually got approved in social partnership earlier on last month, actually. Yeah, we're in December now, aren't we? Last month. So this piece of work has taken us, I co-chaired a group in social partnership that looked at our current policy. And actually we took our policy through an assessment, our current disciplinary policy through an assessment, and actually determined you had to be a degree graduate level age to understand that policy. So if you think about it around accessibility, individuals under significant stress and strain often find themselves reading that policy and how that affects our cognitive abilities and our reading age. We're putting in place a very legalistic document that people are trying to navigate and understand, well, what does this mean for me? What's going to happen to me? So I think we were brought in very, very early on to develop a set of guiding principles that literally guided our work through the last 18 months. And I'm really pleased that what we've actually been able to produce is a much more person-centric focused policy. We've built into the principles around last resort. So what that means is we take a really thorough, standardised fact-finding assessment, which I'm sure colleagues would say, well, we've got a fact-finding assessment in our organisation, and we too had one. But this looks at it through the wider organisational lens. So it doesn't just look through the individual and what happened, but the context of the organisational factors that have driven those incidents. Just to be really, really clear that when we're commissioning investigations, that we're doing so only when we absolutely need to. We've also built in some safeguards into the process so that we can get those decisions so we can oversee those decisions, just to make sure that when we are taking any formal action, that in doing so we have considered all the relevant information. So we've, alongside the policy itself, we've developed a number of how-to procedures that are embedded with that sort of person-centric approach. And we've also developed what you see on the screen there, which is your guide to disciplinary investigation. So we'll have two guides, one for individuals and one for managers. And what that guide has actually done, and we've tested it, haven't it, with various people from not just across the Wales sector, but within England too, is people feel really isolated, as Adrian talks about, when you find yourself receiving that awful letter that says, actually, we've just commissioned an investigation into you. What does this mean for me? And there's been about 25 or so FAQs that individuals think about asking. It says, don't communicate with anyone. You know, we've had people who literally gone home and not spoken to anybody about what they're going through because they're so fearful of doing the wrong thing. What happens to my pay? What does an investigation process look like, etc. So, I think this area, when we tested this with the system early in January, when a number of engagement workshops said, wow, this is absolutely going to be such an important document for individuals to have at their when they receive that letter. So yeah, we're really, really pleased. We've got some compassionate correspondence that aligns to that. So that letter that lands, we can take a much softer approach and understand in really setting out what that means, taking out a lot of that legalistic language. But the policy itself will come into it'll be implemented later on into the spring next year.
Brilliant, thank you. So just kind of unpacking the journey, but actually taking it to that policy piece. I'm very aware of time, but I just want to hand to Deb actually. So Deb from On the Cannon tab. So Deb, how has this landed again within your organisation? And can you tell us that story about how you took an avoidable employee harm approach and how it impacted?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I guess it started, as I mentioned at the very beginning, with conversations with staff and occupational health and HR colleagues, and really understanding, these processes have such a huge impact. And I guess there was a level of discomfort, and we were kind of all saying, there's got to be a different way. And then there was this lovely serendipitous moment that I attended one of these briefings, and I found out that there was a different way. So we initially had conversations with Andrew. We looked at talking to HR colleagues, and that included employee relations, that included D&I colleagues, that included OC health and safety, really looking at those different dimensions in terms of how processes can hit. And we also looked at our data, and that was a really interesting thing for us because it really turned out very similar to the things that Andrew was saying, that we had lengthy processes. The sanctions often then didn't kind of line up with the amount of time that had been invested and the resource that had been invested. So we spoke to our senior leadership team. We talked about what had happened within an Iron Bevan and how they were taking things forward. And they decided to run a pilot within our adult services area. Probably a challenging area for us because particularly when it comes to investigations, they quite often deal with issues that have safeguarding concerns and can be quite complex. So we really wanted to look at some of those lower level issues and see whether we could use this to take some of the slack out, or to give some more slack in the system, I guess, by ensuring that people weren't unnecessarily being put through different processes. We worked alongside them. Andrew and Joe particularly held our hand along the way. They were very gracious and gave us all their paperwork and said, look, see how that's going to fit within your organisation. we worked alongside the managers to contextualise it to make sure it worked, and they really took it to their heart and worked really hard to make sure that it was effective in that particular part of the organisation. We then started to roll it out. It's an ongoing process. As you were saying, you've got to keep going with it. You've got to keep reminding people, and you've got to keep challenging it as well, I guess, if you're going to champion this in your organisation. We're about 2/3 of the organisation through. We've undertaken our first evaluation, and that's already given us some really interesting information in terms of how it's landing within our organisation. Particularly in relation to the angst that managers feel when adopting some of these processes, and thinking what we need to do organisationally in terms of giving them some additional support. But we're definitely seeing a difference in terms of how we support people through these processes, and really asking ourselves the question first, does this need to happen?
We did have a video, but we'd run out of time because I know Sarah's keen to do questions. We'll drop it in a link to an email to you. Oh, it's going to play up by itself. And then just to close, the third part of the book is Charting the Future. How do we draw on occupational health? How do we draw on other colleagues to take an interdisciplinary approach to running investigations? How does the professional bodies like the CIPD champion this work and champion this focus as well? So you might want to order a book. I've given you all the details. There's a bookmark on your seat. But also, in terms of listening to perhaps Liz and Deb, this might be something that would be of interest for you and your organisation. So please do get in touch. Do get in touch with me as well on LinkedIn. Post about this every now and again. But yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you again for the invitation, and I'll hand back to Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. One of the things that I would like to plug as well, because you've just skated over the fact that you do fantastic training programs, and I know because I've sat in one of them, that they are, just absolutely excellent, particularly in those first stages of initiating a journey. So if you are thinking about engaging in this area, I would highly recommend you get in touch with Andrew and see about organising one of these excellent sort of briefing sessions. Right, I'm going to go straight to questions. Right, yes, I've got 2 questions here, but we need microphones.
Hi, the great talk and great conversation. Something really, close to my heart. I've worked 26 years in the public sector. I work at the Intellectual Property Office. 20 odd years ago, I trained as a harassment contact officer, which led to, I'm now heavily involved in public sector coaching and then to mediation. And I think that kind of alternative dispute resolution stuff is kind of key. Did you engage much with that kind of preemptive work? Because a lot of the courses and stuff that I'd run over the years was about how you nipped that stuff in the bud before it got to this, with all of the impact that it has. And what we're increasingly seeing now with court stuff is judges going, before it comes to court, can you get mediated? So yeah, I wondered how much any of that sort of stuff had dialed in.
Pastor Adrian to pick that one up in the first.
Yeah, so because this is specifically around disciplinary investigations, I think the mediation, the early preventative mediation, although you could also say mediation is not preventative, it's in terms of when do things start, but yeah, early is good, according to ACAS, which I absolutely agree with. So we've not looked at those resources specifically in the context of disciplinaries by virtue of how they develop, but what we do is when we are encouraging HR colleagues and managers to, in that early stage, to understand the context and understand what's happened, to also get them to think creatively about options. So at that stage, you would be thinking, well, maybe, could there be some other way of responding to the incident? Let's just say, health, drug error. What's it about? And you could kind of nail the offending member of staff to the wall and then, probably scar them for life. Or you could go, well, how did this happen? because we don't want it to happen again, because that's what we really want. And if you start asking those questions, then you can go backwards and go, okay, what could we have done differently? And it might have come out of a dispute, it might have come out of a local cultural issue, it might have come out of just somebody just knackered. But that's the space, I think, where some mediation, some mentoring, some support, some training, sometimes even therapy, not always the answer, but sometimes those things could be the best route forward to help the system prevent the error happening again. So that's where I would see that would work. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I've got two questions, if I may. First of all, to Andrew and Adrian. Debra referenced it when she was discussing RCT Council, how she got buy-in from the SMT, partly because another organisation had done it previously. So I'd be interested in understanding how you convinced your senior leaders to take the leap of faith and implement this in the first instance. And then secondly, my question to Liz, given your previous experience working in the private sector, how transferable you would see this in the private sector as well as the public sector?
Really good question. Oh, I need the mic. Really important question in terms of getting executive level involvement. I think there were a number of things that we did. The fact that our HR team were actually looking at cases and really looking to dive down into the data was really important. They weren't just looking at the number of cases we'd run. They wanted to see how many had ended up with no sanctions. So that data was really powerful and important. I think Adrian's talked about the employee counselling service that we run. That was providing anecdotal in terms of we're seeing an increase in staff coming to us in terms of real that employee potential harm and impact. But also, how do we get our senior HR director on board within the organisation? And I know Adrian's talked on a number of occasions when we shared this with her, the concept of avoidable employee harm. She wasn't comfortable with it at first. It was like, oh, I'm not sure I want to stand on a stage and say this. I'm not sure. I have to say a lot of this work has grown out of her courage to actually do that. And in July 2022, she stood up in front of about 100 of our staff and said, we are causing harm. We have to do this differently. And then it was that conversation that was enabled to take up into our exec team, that the exec team then recognised we have to take a different approach. And that's where the last resort approach really came from, because what that did was it gave air cover for managers and HR colleagues to do something a bit different, because often within organisations like the NHS, that has been the default response. But because the exec was saying, no, we are pursuing a last resort approach, then actually this gives us permission to do something different. Have I covered everything?
Yeah, just only to add, so Sarah Simmons, our Director of Workforce, key in authorising this, both at a kind of operational level, but also at a kind of cultural level. She has a chapter in the book, so that also is a symbol of her commitment to this process. But I think the courage that she demonstrated in getting this going or allowing this to happen and putting money into it, it's got to have money. And bring the organisational commitment. It's a bit like an improvement process. You can't just stop that. You've got to keep being courageous, because actually along this journey, it's changed shape as well. So I know Sarah's talked to me about how uncomfortable it is sometimes when people use it against HR or the organisation, saying, "Well, you've harmed me." How do you deal with that? And I think that's part of that cultural change narrative. So it's not just about going, yes, it's a good idea, we'll do it. It's about staying the course. And I'm absolutely grateful for her and respect her courage for doing that in a very politicised context.
We've also gone into, so we've been working with the HPMA, which is their national body, and certainly the chief exec of that organisation as well went on the record and said, actually, I realised I'd caused harm to individuals in the past. So in a sense, change begins with honesty, and it's those leaders who are prepared to say, I've got this wrong, but we need to change, really creates the energy for that. Liz.
So I'll come at the second bit of the question about, transferability into private sector. So, yeah, I've had the opportunity to work in lots of sectors, and I'm really grateful for the career that I've had. The short answer is yes, absolutely, because ultimately people are people. So we all end up in, people end up in processes for one reason or another, irrelevant of the sector they find themselves in. But let me talk about the bottom line and the commercial driver here as well. A process costs money, a lot of money. It also costs a lot of organisational noise and energy. So whilst people are focusing on an investigation, they're not doing their day job. So the amount of time it takes managers out of their day job to undertake investigations, or the energy that your HR team take up to employee relations cases, which could be diverted onto the sexy stuff in an organisation, the stuff that will really drive the organisation forward, is all time wasted in the process. So from a sales pitch point of view to a commercial organisation and private sector organisation, there are absolutely a whole load of reasons why. We worked out our costs in our service. I know, Andrew mentioned his, ours are more expensive, about 32k a process. That's an awful lot of money to be wasting. For me, that's taxpayer money. So inherently, whether it's taxpayer money or whether it's, your investors' money, whatever the driver is, it costs you a lot in energy and cash, and potentially you lose really good people, because how you manage this type of process will speak to the rest of your team, because they'll go, hang on a minute, that could be me in that process. Do I want to work in an organisation that deals with things in this way? And we all want the best people. There's a hard market out there in order to attract candidates, and how you do this kind of stuff then will get you the best candidates and will get you the best people in your organisation.
I'm going to have to draw the breakfast briefing to a close, and I'd like to end by thanking our panelists for coming along today and giving an absolutely, super presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out in a really grotty day. Much appreciated. Thanks to all our friends online, and hopefully we will see you all again early next year. Thanks very much indeed.